Free speech and the First Amendment are hanging by a thread in America. Now, that is what many people believed in 1918. Let me set the scene. You've just defiled, desecrated, and disrespected the American flag in protest of the draft. You've been arrested, charged with a crime, and found guilty. You've now been sentenced to 20 years in prison and fined approximately $202,000. That would be in 2023 dollars. Now, your friend is upset with what the government of the United States of America has just done to you. He objects to the way the U.S. government handled the incident. So now, as an American citizen, it is his right and duty to voice his objections. So, at that time, you would write a letter to the editor explaining how the government and the president are wrong. First Amendment of the Constitution in the Bill of Rights says citizens have the right of free speech, which, by the way, those first 10 amendments are absolute. That was the deal made to ratify the Constitution. No Bill of Rights, no Constitution. Well, anyways, back to your letter of disagreement. The paper prints your friend's letter. He's happy. He feels he has fulfilled his responsibility as a citizen. Until, wait for it, federal agents knock on his door and arrest him for sedition. Now, as they haul him away in cuffs, he screams out, "You can't arrest me! I have rights! The First Amendment guarantees me my right of free speech!" The agent looks at him and laughs, then says, "Not anymore, brother." Now, the two of you are sitting in prison, reevaluating your course of action, while the paper that printed the letter has reevaluated their editorial policy. No more unpatriotic letters to the editor. No, I'm not describing an event in 2023. This happened back in 1918 during World War I. It was called the Sedition Act, passed by Congress and signed by President Wilson. From the introduction of the act to becoming law, it took only 30 days. The only other thing that gets passed faster in Congress are the continuing resolutions to raise the debt ceiling and congressional pay raises. So, what was the Sedition Act of 1918 as opposed to the Alien and Sedition Act of 1789 under President John Adams? Well, America had been at war with the Central Powers. Now that would be the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire since April 1917. The Espionage Act, that was passed in June of 1917, and it was designed to crack down on wartime activities considered dangerous or disloyal or harmful to the United States. Activities and behaviors considered illegal would be attempts to acquire defense-related information with the intent to harm the U.S. or acquire code and signal books, photographs, blueprints, and any other such documents with the intent of passing them to America's enemies. Now that seems reasonable. It was wartime. All those acts are considered espionage or giving aid and comfort to the enemy. However, the government went even further, making it a crime for a person to make false statements intended to interfere with military operations, attempt to incite insubordination, or obstruct the recruitment of troops, and false statements, prompting the success of America's enemies. Now, those charged with violations were subject to a $10,000 fine and or 20 years imprisonment. If the crimes were committed during wartime, the punishment could be 30 years imprisonment or even the death penalty. But that was not enough for President Wilson and the Super Patriots. Something else was needed. Oh, by the way, the Espionage Act is still on the books today. Now, the Wilson Center published an overview of Professor Jeffrey Stone's book, Perilous Times. Stone stated in his book, quote, "As a scholar at Princeton University, Wilson had written that the best approach to criticism of war was to allow unfettered debate. Wilson, the president, however, did not heed the advice of Wilson, the scholar," end quote. From April 1917 till April 1918, President Wilson was taking heat from different people and organizations about how he was conducting America's war effort and not cracking down on unpatriotic behavior. It was becoming too much for the president. So, the great progressive President Woodrow Wilson pushed Congress for extremely aggressive legislation that would end the criticism of the war and of President Wilson himself. Now that Wilson was president, the dissenting voices throughout America had to be stifled. Now that Wilson was president, the dissenting voices throughout America had to be stifled. Now, the Bill of Rights, First Amendment, clearly states, Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the rights of the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Pretty self-explanatory, right? Well, not so fast. You see, we are dealing with politicians here. Some are extremely smart, others are, well, let's just say some are of mediocre intellect and never think through the consequences of their actions. This was true back then, and unfortunately, I believe it's true today. So if Article 1 says Congress shall make no laws, why did the Sedition Act pass? Well, the U.S. was at war, as I said, and one of the first casualties in any war are truth and free speech. So, what was the Sedition Act? Okay, April 17, 1918, legislation was introduced to protect the American people from disloyal Americans. You see, many Americans were upset with the government not cracking down on disloyal speech. Due to this lack of prosecutions, there were many incidents of citizens using mob rule to quell seditious behavior and speech. Now, the lynching of Robert Prager, a famous example of super patriots and mob rule. Prager was a German immigrant who, because of his status, was denied membership in the United Mine Workers of America and Local. Believing he was being unfaithfully treated, he wrote a letter stating the unfairness of his situation and then posted copies of his letter all over town of Collinsville, Illinois. This angered the patriotic mine workers. They dragged him from his home, humiliated him by wrapping in an American flag and walking him through town, and then lynched him. Wilson saw the Sedition Act as a way to show the American people that the U.S. government would prosecute seditious speech and behavior and hopefully dissuade patriotic Americans from using mob rule. The Sedition Act was an amendment to the 1917 Espionage Act. Now, per this amendment, a person could be fined $10,000 and sentenced to 20 years in jail or prison if they willfully committed any of the following acts when the United States is at war. The list is pretty long. For example, make or convey false reports or false statements with the intent to interfere with the operations or success of the military or naval forces of the United States. Promote the success of its enemies. Make or convey false reports or false statements to an investor or investors with the intent to obstruct the sale of the United States of bonds or other securities of the United States or the making of loans by or to the United States. Whoever caused or attempted to cause or incited or attempted to incite insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States, or obstruct or attempt to obstruct the recruiting or enlistment services of the United States. Whoever willfully uttered, print, write, or published any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States, or the military and naval forces of the United States, or the flag of the United States, or the uniform of the Army or Navy of the United States, into contempt, scorn, or disrepute, or utter, print, write, or publish any language intended to incite, provoke, or encourage resistance to the United States, or to promote the cause of its enemies, or shall display the flag of any foreign country, or shall by utterance, writing, printing, publication, or language spoken, urge, incite, or advocate any curtailment of production in this country of any thing or things, product or products necessary or essential to the prosecution of the war. Whoever advocates, teach, defends, or suggests the doing of any of the acts or things in this section enumerated, support or favor the cause of any country with which the United States is at war, oppose the cause of the United States therein, shall be punished by a fine of not more than $10,000 or the imprisonment for not more than 20 years, or both. Yeah, but it gets even better. Not only were they not content with gutting the First Amendment, Wilson and the 65th Congress decided to go after the Fourth Amendment. You know the whole securing your person's house and effects against unreasonable search and seizure shall not be violated. Well, the government decided it had to see what you were thinking. Yep, that's right, what you were thinking. Now this was done by reading your mail. Section 4 of the Sedition Act states, when the United States is at war, the Postmaster General may, upon evidence satisfactory to him that any person or concern is using the mails in violation of any of the provisions of this act, instruct the postmaster at any post office at which mail is received addressed to such person or concern to return to the postmaster at the office at which they were originally mailed all letters or other matters so addressed with the words mail to this address undeliverable under the Espionage Act, plainly written or stamped upon the outside thereof, and all such letters or other matters so returned to such postmaster shall be by them returned to the sender thereof under such regulations as Postmaster General may prescribe. Heck, I'm surprised Wilson and Congress didn't just make a clean sweep of it and got the whole Bill of Rights. So we have a political appointee, local postmaster. He had the right to open private mail, read it, then decide whether or not the sender had violated the Sedition Act. Yeah, I can see where petty score settling might come into play for this one. Now, with the introduction of the Sedition Act in Congress, the mainstream newspapers were mostly supportive of the act, surprisingly. Now, the socialist newspapers obviously were upset. They were the main target of the repression in the Sedition Act. Now, the day before the Sedition Act was introduced, however, Senator George Chamberlain of Oregon introduced his bill that would have any citizen or military personnel tried by courts-martial in a military tribunal under the Espionage Sedition Act. Now, Chamberlain was also a lawyer. He realized what he proposed was borderline unconstitutional. Under Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, the privilege of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when, in case of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Chamberlain believed the existing laws were not strong enough to convict persons charged with espionage or sedition. Chamberlain wanted the death penalty for all spying and sedition. The New York Sun, April 17th edition, quotes Chamberlain. It is the belief of Senator Chamberlain and many other members of the upper house that the possibility of legal delays upon petty technicalities is hampering the Department of Justice in obliterating the menace of sedition and espionage. Petty technicalities, I don't know, such as warrants being required for a search. That would be the Fourth Amendment. No person shall be held to answer for a capital crime or other infamous crime unless on presentment of an indictment of a grand jury, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. That, I believe, is the Fifth Amendment. Now, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. That's the Sixth Amendment. A military tribunal is not impartial. Now, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. That's the Eighth Amendment. So you get the whole death penalty there, military tribunal, they're not out on bail. Now, Senator Chamberlain is not talking about German agents in the armed forces of Germany. He wanted to include all American citizens as well. Now, Chamberlain went on to give his 6 reasons why his bill was needed to get rid of these petty technicalities. The war cannot be run in criminal courts by the DOJ. The Army should deal with enemy activities. Congress grants all authority to the Army and Navy necessary. The moral effect of one man arrested and tried by courts-martial is worth more than 100 men tried by the Department of Justice in the criminal courts. The one feature of bail alone makes criminal courts unsuited for war crimes. Jeez. Enemy activities are activities which must be promptly punished to prevent further activities. Luckily, Wilson believed Chamberlain's bill went too far. Wilson published his letter to Senator Chamberlain in the New York Sun, April 23rd edition, 1918. He comes right out and says it. I am wholly and unalterably opposed to such legislation. I think it is not only unconstitutional, but that in character it would put us nearly upon the level of the very people we are fighting, Prussianism. Chamberlain's bill was defeated. God only knows what would have happened if it had passed. By April 24, 1918, the Senate conference report on the Sedition Act was brought before the whole Senate for debate. Immediately, Senator Hiram Johnson, California, protested the removal of the France Amendment. Now, Senator Joseph France of Maryland attempted to introduce an amendment to the act that would have ensured limited free speech protections, but the amendment was defeated, and France stated the legislation was criminal, repressive, and characteristics of the Dark Ages. Now, the gist of the amendment said, nothing in this act shall be construed as limiting the liberty or impairing the rights of individuals to publish or speak what is true with good motives and justifiable ends. Senator Johnson said of the bill, what a travesty it is now for Congress to prohibit the people of the Union the right to speak the truth for justifiable ends. Now, Senator Lee Overman, North Carolina, entered into the record a letter from the DOJ. Now, it was the opinion of the Department of Defense that the France Amendment would weaken the effectiveness of the law when it came to dealing with German propaganda in this country, since it would open up a wide field of arguments. Yeah, that pesky old Bill of Rights. Anyways, in New York Sun, May 3rd edition, the story headline stated, Sedition Bill foes see end of liberty. Act would curb free speech. Senator William Borah of Idaho, considered one of the greatest orators of the Senate, was quoted, you enable the Postmaster General to say what newspaper may live. I have seen what newspapers and magazines excluded from the mail during the last 6 months as disloyal, and I confess that I have been unable to see the disloyalty that the Post Office Department found in taking action. This section would put a censorship over the people of the United States until public opinion could not be declared to exist. Now, by May 8, 1918, the opponents of the Sedition Act unleashed the big gun. Former President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, got into the fray. On May 8, 1918 edition of the New York Tribune, printed TR's letter to America. He opens with, the legislation now being enacted by Congress should deal drastically with sedition. It should also guarantee the right of the press and the people to speak freely of all their public servants, including the President, whenever they come short of their public duty. Now, TR and Wilson could not stand each other. Roosevelt believed Wilson was weak. In a letter to his son Kermit, he called Wilson a shifty phrase maker who was too proud to fight. I kind of like that. He believed Wilson was dragging our honor in the dust. Further in the letter, TR wrote, to announce that there must be no criticism of the president, right or wrong, is not only unpatriotic and servile, but is morally treasonable to the American public. Nothing but the truth should be spoken about him or anyone else. But it is even more important to tell the truth, pleasant or unpleasant, about him than anyone else. By May 7, 1918, the Senate passed the Joint Act 48 to 26, and on the same day, the House passed the Joint Act by a vote of 292 to 1. Wilson signed the Sedition Act into law on May 16, 1918. First Amendment died that day with the signing into law of the Sedition Act until its repeal in 1920. It's been estimated that over 2,000 people were charged under the Act. Some of the more famous cases brought to court under the Act were the Shinnick v. United States, 1919. In this case, two defendants, Shinnick and Barr, members and leaders of the local Socialist Party, had been indicted under the Espionage Act for sending literature to recently conscripted soldiers, suggesting that the draft was a form of involuntary servitude that violated the 13th Amendment. They were convicted, and the case went to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court upheld the conviction under the clear and present danger doctrine. It was Justice Holmes who stated the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. The character of the writing depends upon the circumstances under which it is done. Therefore, the question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that will bring about the substantive evil that Congress has a right to prevent. America needed an army, and volunteers were not enough, so the country instituted a draft. Speaking out against the draft was sedition. 40 years later, in the 1960s, students were protesting the draft without a problem. Heck, Jane Fonda went to Vietnam during the conflict and protested about the war. However, when the protests became violent, then it became an issue in the criminal courts, but it wasn't a military tribunal in the 60s. Eugene Debs versus U.S. On June 16, 1918, Debs gave a speech outside the Canton, Ohio prison where he had visited 3 socialists convicted of violating the Sedition Act. He gave a speech in which he condemned the war. He was convicted of obstructing military recruitment and enlistment. He was found guilty, then sentenced to 10 years. He appealed and the Supreme Court upheld his conviction. Justice Holmes wrote in his opinion that little attention was needed since the Debs case was essentially the same as that of the Shinnick case, in which the court had upheld a similar conviction. Now, in Abrams versus United States, 1919, the defendants were convicted on the basis of 2 leaflets they printed and threw from windows of a building in New York City. One leaflet signed "Revolutionists" denounced the sending of American troops to Russia. The second leaflet, written in Yiddish, denounced the war and America's efforts to impede the Russian Revolution. It advocated the cessation of the production of weapons to be used against the Soviet Union. The defendants were charged and convicted of inciting resistance to the war effort and urging curtailment of production of essential war materials. They were sentenced to 10 and 20 years in prison. Supreme Court upheld the conviction 7-2. The majority held that the defendants intended to hinder war production could be inferred from their words and that Congress had determined such expressions posed an imminent danger. Now, the interesting thing in this case was one of the dissenting justices was Oliver Wendell Holmes. In his dissenting opinion, he wrote that the defendants did not have the requisite intent to cripple or hinder the United States in the persecution of the war against Germany. The defendants were objecting only to the United States intervention in Russia. At that time, Russia was in the middle of a civil war. The defendants therefore lacked the specific intent to commit the crime of obstructing the war effort. Holmes was reevaluating his clear and present danger doctrine by this time. Now, the most absurd sedition case was that of William C. Edenborn. William C. Edenborn was a German-born, naturalized American citizen and a major industrialist. He gave a speech in 1918 to a local club that was considered sedition by the National Security League. That was a patriotic group that went around looking for anybody who might be pro-German or say anything un-American. They wrote to the Department of Justice and demanded that Edenborn be charged with espionage and sedition. The story in the Birmingham Age Herald, April 29, 1918, stated Edenborn gave a speech in which he said, "We need have no fear Germany will ever attack the United States. It would take a maritime nation to do that because it is surrounded by water." He was arrested and detained. However, the higher-ups in the Department of Justice decided not to follow through with the charges. At least someone realized doing otherwise would have made the government look like fools. So, anyways, with the war over, Congress started to repeal many of the wartime acts. The Sedition Act was repealed on December 13, 1920. That's basically over a year. In the waning days of the Wilson administration, he offered clemency to most of these convicted under the Sedition Act. However, he hated Debs, so Debs remained in prison, and that was up to Warren G. Harding to pardon him on December 23, 1921. The Espionage Act has never been repealed. It is and has continually been updated. It was used in the Rosenberg case in the 50s and the New York Times Pentagon Papers case in 71. Most recently, it has been used in the case of Jack Teixeira, the U.S. Air Force reservist charged with posting classified documents on the web, and of course, former President Donald Trump. So, what have we learned from this slice of history? Censoring speech in a free society is extremely dangerous. When the government does it, it is usually an indication the speech is about something embarrassing to the government. But when private groups try to censor people, it can become deadly. Now, the Prager incident, perfect example. The good citizens of Collinsville, Illinois did not like the fact that Prager felt he was being unfairly treated by the local miners' union, and they let it be known through a public letter. So these patriotic Americans decided Prager was a German sympathizer. They humiliated him, then hung him. Yeah, I wonder if the lynch mob believed they deserved a medal for that one. Now today, these groups use the tool of canceling. When you don't have a chance to defend or explain yourself, you are just canceled. As I said in my opening, free speech and the First Amendment are hanging by a thread. It has always been hanging by a thread, though, since the ratification of the Constitution, June 21st, 1788, and the subsequent ratification of the Bill of Rights on December 15th, 1791. Now, a perfect example of censorship just happened in the U.S. Congress during the committee hearing on the weaponizing of government agencies and censorship. An elected representative wanted a witness to be censored. The representative in question requested the chairman to revoke the witness's invitation to testify based on selective facts. Now, here's the C-SPAN videotape.
I recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Washington-Schultz. Good job.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we respectfully requested that you rescind Mr. Kennedy's invitation to appear here due to his repeated and very recent statements that spread dangerous anti-Semitic and anti-Asian conspiracy theories and attempted to move into executive session because House rules prohibit public testimony that degrades or defames people. His reckless rhetoric helped fuel anti-Semitic incidents, which for the record are at the highest level in the United States since 1970. They have nearly tripled in the last 6 years. Since you gave Mr. Kennedy a megaphone today, I want to give him a chance to correct his statements and prepare some of the harm that he's helped cause. Mr. Kennedy, you're well educated, so yes or no, please. Are you aware that for centuries Jews have been scapegoated and blamed for causing illnesses like Black Plague and more recently COVID?
I am. Those are known as blood libel, and they are one of the worst and most disturbing parts of human history.
Good. I'm glad to know that, of course, that you acknowledge that. Of course, it's true and well documented that this pernicious form of anti-Semitism led to centuries of discrimination, even horrific pogroms and massacres, and it still fuels deadly violence today. Yet last week, you floated a baseless conspiracy theory that the coronavirus was bioengineered to target Caucasians and black people, but to spare Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people. Mr. Kennedy, your bizarre, unproven claim echoes that same historic slander of labeling Jews and Chinese people as a race, and that Jews, and in this case Chinese people, somehow managed to avoid a deadly illness that targets other groups for death. You do see that, yes or no?
You're misstating.
No. I quoted what you said earlier, and it is directly what you said. So just ask me yes or no.
I was describing an NIH-funded study.
No, you didn't cite any.
I was describing an NIH-funded study by Cleveland Clinic scientists.
Reclaiming my time. You did not reference. Reclaiming my time.
Published in USC Medical, which is one of...
The time is mine. I'm reclaiming it. Please ask the witness to stop talking.
You asked me a question.
Reclaiming.
Allow me to answer my question.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like about 10 seconds back.
You are slandering me incorrectly. You're saying it's dishonest.
Time belongs to the gentlelady from Florida.
And myself.
Mr.
Time
Chairman,
belongs to the gentlelady from Florida.
I'd like 15 seconds back.
We will be happy to give you that.
Thank you so much. You did not.
Now, as you notice, Robert Kennedy tried to defend himself by explaining his words were being taken out of context. The New York Post even uploaded a video of Mr. Kennedy citing the study he was trying to tell the representative, but she just kept cutting him off. Now, since this is copyrighted material, I cannot play the New York Post video. I have placed the link in the description box below, so you can decide for yourself. I think a quote from Theodore Roosevelt's letter to the American people is a good point to end this video. He sums up the duty of every American citizen perfectly. We must, quote, guarantee the right of the press and the people to speak freely of all their public servants, including the President, whenever they come short of their public duty. To announce that there must be no criticism of the President, right or wrong, is not only unpatriotic and servile, but it is morally treasonable to the American public. Nothing but the truth should be spoken about him or anyone else, but it is even more important to tell the truth, pleasant or unpleasant, about him than about anyone else. Well, I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please click the like button, ring the bell, and subscribe to my channel. But most importantly, leave a comment below. Thank you for watching.